Good morning. Wow. See anybody here? Let's try again. Good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to turn to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13. We have been out of our study of Luke for the last few weeks, and we're jumping back in this week. But I do want to give you a fair warning, as you not get too excited about getting back into Luke, that we will jump back out for the next few weeks. Next Sunday is Palm Sunday. We're going to celebrate that. Easter Sunday is the Sunday after. And then the week after Easter, we actually have the privilege of having a pastor's college student coming to preach at our church the Sunday after Easter, Ethan Montesinos, who has visited our church a number of times and was divinely appointed by the dean of the pastor's college to come in to preach here. And we're excited about having him. And so the next few weeks, we'll be back out of Luke, but then I promise the week after that, we're getting back in, and we're going to stay there for a while. And I am excited about that. All right, so this morning, what we're going to look at is we're going to close out chapter 13. We're actually coming to a nice end point, or a break point, to say, in our study of Luke's gospel. And so this morning we'll be beginning in verse 31, and we'll go through the end of the chapter to verse 35. And this is God's holy, inspired, and inerrant word. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he, meaning Jesus, said to them, "Go and tell that fox, 'Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? Behold, your house is forsaken. And I tell you, you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Anybody ever heard of Aesop? Is that name? I'm sure yeah. Of course, my daughter does. She knows everybody who has written anything in the last 2,000 years. Actually, Aesop was before 2,000 years ago. But Aesop was a Greek fabulist and storyteller who was somewhere in between 500 and 600 BC. And he was famous for having collected a number of short stories and tales known as Aesop's fables. Now, his most famous one is the story of the tortoise and the hare, but he also has one titled The Fox and the Hen. And I'm going to read from it this morning, kids. It's story time with Pastor Dave. How fun is that? We're going to pick up in the story. There's a fox who sees a hen. The hen is up in its nest, and the fox is trying to lure the hen out of the nest. And he says to the hen, he says, "Have you heard the wonderful news?" cried the fox in a very joyful and excited manner. "What news?" said the hen calmly. But he had a fluttering feeling inside, for, she was very much afraid of the fox. The fox replied, "Your family and mine and all the other animals have agreed to forget their differences and live in peace and friendship from now on forevermore. Just think of it. I simply cannot wait to embrace you. Do come down, dear friend, and let us celebrate this joyful event." "How grand," said the hen. "I am certainly delighted at that news." But she spoke in an absent way, and stretching up on her tiptoes, seemed to be looking at something far off in the distance. The fox got a little anxious and asked the hen, "What is it that you see?" "Why," said the hen, "it looks like to me a couple of dogs are on their way. They must have heard the good news But the fox did not wait to hear any more. Off he started to run. "Wait," cried the hen. "Why are you running? The dogs they're your friends now, right?" "Yes," said the fox, "but they might not have heard the news yet. Besides, I have a very important errand that I had almost forgotten about." The hen smiled as she buried her head in her feathers and went to sleep, for she had succeeded in outwitting a very crafty enemy. Now, the fox and the hen, it's a fun little story that tells the story of a fox who was tricky, but a hen who was much wiser than the fox. And what's interesting is in our passage this morning, Jesus is using the same imagery that Aesop did. Aesop used the imagery of a fox and a hen, and Jesus uses the same imagery, only in a very different way, to mildly say. Now, similar to Aesop, Jesus likens the fox to someone who would seek to deceive him and seek to destroy him, to get Jesus to go where he didn't want to go and to lure Jesus out from where he was. But then Jesus uses the imagery of the hen to describe himself, and not just one who is outsmarting the fox, which he is, but to describe himself as one who has an earnest desire to care for, to nurture, and to save all and protect all who would come to him. In this passage, the fox is likened to Herod, who would desire to deceive and to kill, and the hen is likened to Jesus, who has a desire to nurture. But just because Jesus has the desire to nurture does not mean that all will be nurtured by him, because Jesus tells us that many end up rejecting him. And Jesus tells us in this story that those who reject him, that there are consequences that come with it. And they are desperate and they are dire. But Jesus also holds out hope for those who have previously rejected him, in order that they might turn to him for life and security. Now, I'll say on the front end that passages like these, I know it certainly has for me this week, but these kinds of passages, they have a way of causing us to take inventory on our lives, to have a way of recalibrating and making sure that we are building our lives upon the right things. And so this morning, before we even dive in, I want to just ask you a few questions for you to be thinking about and contemplating as we work our way through this passage. And so I would ask, what is it that you are trusting in this morning for your security? Like, what is it that you're really, really trusting in? Is it your family? Is it your wisdom, your gifting? Is it your morality and good behavior? Is it your 401k? Is it your charitable contributions to others? Is it your influence and gifting? Is it the hope that your good deeds in the end will outweigh your bad ones? Or is it that you are trusting in Christ alone for your security? Now, obviously, we're way too sophisticated to outwardly admit that we're trusting in anything other than Jesus, right? We're here. We're at church on a Sunday morning. Of course, that's the answer to the question. But Jesus has a way of piercing past what we say and what we outwardly appear to be doing, in order that the words of our lips and the intentions of our hearts are all revealed. Now, keep in mind, who is Jesus talking to here? He's talking to a group of very devout, religious people. A people who would have seen themselves as secure, as God's people, as God's chosen nation, Israel. And yet Jesus is warning them that they are trusting in something that ultimately will not protect them. And so passages like these, even for Christians, should in some way strike us like a bolt of lightning, arresting our attention and causing us to again take inventory on our priorities. Because let's be honest, we're human and our priorities shift so quickly. So let's allow the Spirit to do that very thing as we look at this passage. We're going to look at it in two sections this morning. The first section being the rejection of Jesus, and then the second section being the lament of Jesus. So let's look at the rejection of Jesus, and this is going to come from verses 31 to 33. Now, we've seen throughout the study of Luke's gospel, we've seen this growing animosity between the Pharisees and Jesus. We've seen already that Jesus pronounced a series of woes to the Pharisees in chapter 11. And as a result of Jesus pronouncing these woes upon them, they didn't take that too kindly. And the Pharisees and the scribes began to devise plans on how they might trap Jesus. Luke 11 tells us, that the scribes and the Pharisees began to press Jesus hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. That's Luke 11, 53 and 54. In other words, the Pharisees have been looking for an opportunity to trap Jesus in something he might say or do. They've been looking for ways to manipulate him. Now, Luke tells us here in verse 31 that some of these Pharisees have come to Jesus. They've come to give Jesus a warning. They said to him, "You should leave here because Herod wants to kill you." Now, if you hear those words, Herod wants to kill you, Herod is a man with a reputation for following through on what he says he would do. Remember, it is Herod who beheaded or had John the Baptist beheaded. And so this sounds like a nice tip to hear, right? Like, Herod's coming for you. He wants to kill you. You should get out of here, out of his territory quickly. But keep in mind that Herod suffered a lot of political blowback for his murder of John the Baptist. And Herod did not want the type of uprising and revolt that came with putting an innocent, popular man to death. And so here we find that Herod is trying to use different tactics. He's trying to threaten Jesus by using the Pharisees as his mouthpiece in hopes that he can lure Jesus out of his region and into another. And of course, the Pharisees were excited about this plan because there's nothing that the Pharisees would love more than to see Jesus move into the region of Judea. If they could get Jesus to move over into Judea, then he would fall under the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin would then be able to deal with Jesus and hopefully, in the mind of the Pharisees, put an end to his ministry. So this seemed like a win-win for both Herod and the Pharisees. But on the surface, what may have seemed like a friendly warning of safety, Jesus was not in the least bit fooled. He was not fooled by the foxes. He knew that there was collusion between his enemies. And so Jesus tells the Pharisees to send a message of his own to Herod. And he says in verse 32, "You go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course." Now, in our culture, calling someone a fox, it usually comes with some kind of, adolescent term of endearment is probably the best way to describe that. I think about the song by Jimi Hendrix, "Foxy Lady." That was a thing you used to call people who were quote-unquote good-looking back in the day. I don't recommend it these days. These days it's not safe to do that, probably rightly so. But in Hebrew culture, to call someone a fox or to designate someone as a fox, it kind of had this twofold meaning. First, it meant that someone was sly or cunning or tricky or deceptive. But it also came with this secondary meaning that someone was insignificant or worthless. In other words, Jesus using the term fox to describe Herod was an expression of utter contempt for him. He understood that, like a fox, that Herod was trying to be tricky and deceptive. He was trying to manipulate Jesus. And it's interesting that Jesus tags him with this line, because here is a man who is a ruler with power that is unparalleled, right? He can do whatever he wants, and yet here he is resorting to underhanded tactics in order to try to manipulate people. And Jesus is saying, you're like a fox. You try to be tricky, but in the end, you're insignificant and worthless. If you're a ruler, by the way, if you are a leader of people, if you're a boss, if you think that your position of authority and the way in which you lead people is by manipulation, you're kind of like a fox. It's an insignificant, worthless way in which to lead people. And Jesus is exposing that. Notice that Jesus he makes this reference to today, tomorrow, and the third day. It's right here in verse 32. And he's going to use that same terminology in verse 33 as well. And Jesus is describing, he's like, yeah, no, I'll leave when I'm ready. I got 3 days of work left here to do, and then I'll leave, but I'm not leaving because I'm under any fear of threat of my life being taken. And by saying this, Jesus is not only giving a message to Herod, hey, I still got 3 works to do, I'll leave after that. But Jesus is also giving a cryptic reference to Herod about his imminent resurrection. No one would have understood that. Now, Luke's readers, by the time they read it, they would have seen it, understood it. But Jesus also has a word not just for Herod, but he also has a word for the Pharisees, who are also a part of this conspiracy. In verse 33, Jesus shifts this word of warning away from Herod, or this message away from Herod, and over to the Pharisees. He says to them, nevertheless, I must go on my way again today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting, it's providential, that Jesus defines his mission in terms of Jerusalem. He ties his mission into that very city. And Jesus knows that he must continue to complete his ministry, but that the climax of his ministry must take place and end in Jerusalem. Jesus has to go to Jerusalem, but in order that he might take on and assume his role as a suffering Messiah who will fulfill a long line of God's prophets who have been rejected and killed in that city. Now, the sarcasm here by Jesus is pretty amazing to me. I love sarcasm. Not everybody's a fan of it. Count me in the camp of people who are a fan of it. It's just striking to me, because here the Pharisees, they want to see Jesus die. They want to see him just gone. And Jesus knows that. But he's basically saying to them, I best be on my way and complete my ministry so I can make my way to Jerusalem and die there like all the other prophets. Now, the irony here is unmistakable. They want him dead. He knows he's going to die, but he's not going to die where he is. He has to go to Jerusalem to do the very thing that they want him to do, which is just to go away. And the irony here is unmistakable, because Jesus is refusing to depart from this region in order that he's not under the threat of death, but then he's saying, I got to go, and when I go, I'm going to die and do the very thing that you want. I know I said that 2 different ways, the same thing. That's what happened when I get off my script. I repeat myself, and it's not good. But in essence here, what Jesus is saying to both Herod and to the Pharisees who are conspiring against him is, I do not fear you. I don't fear your death threats. I don't fear you trying to take my life. My life is not yours for the taking. But he's also in many ways saying to them, if you want to see me dead, if you want to try and end my life, just meet me in Jerusalem, because that is when and where it will take place. I'm always struck I read through the Gospels and I just see Jesus at work and I marvel. But when I come to passages like this, it causes me to be more in awe of Jesus and not just in his ministry, but the way in which he carried out his ministry, knowing that at any point his death was imminent. I mean, he was despised, he was rejected by the very people he came to be saved, that he came to save, and all the while the mind of Christ was fixed upon Calvary. And yet in the midst of it all, Jesus never became anxious. He never became agitated with them. I mean, just think about the number of times that you and I become frustrated when things aren't going our way, or when we're doing things for our loved ones for their own good, and yet they're not receiving it as good. I mean, how many times do we respond by becoming cold or distant or harsh towards them? I mean, you would have expected at any point that Jesus would just angrily say to all of them, "Don't you understand who I am and what I've come to do? That I'm going to die and be raised for you?" Seriously, how slow can you people be? I mean, that's what you would expect Jesus to say at any point, and yet he never does that. Jesus never sinfully snaps at his detractors. He never becomes impatient with his disciples. Yes, he's firm, and he's truthful, and he's honest with those who are hell-bent on rejecting him or seeing his demise. But Jesus is also constantly and consistently patient with those who are slow to understand what he came to do for them. And with his crucifixion fixed upon his mind daily, Jesus is never deterred. He's never distracted. He is focused and determined while also being gracious and merciful all along the way. And it astounds me. All right, let's look at our second point. The lament of Jesus. This is verses 34 and 35. So Jesus, here we find him continuing to speak about Jerusalem. And the city of Jerusalem it's not just a city. To say Jerusalem is to talk about more than a city. It's to describe an entire people, a nation of people. And here we find that Jesus' tone is both prophetic and yet sorrowful. And in many ways, verse 34, it reads like a soliloquy. It reads like something that just that expresses the heartfelt desire of Jesus for these people. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and yet you were not willing." Now, how's this for a description? Jesus describes the great city of Jerusalem in the sharpest and darkest terms. Imagine you were taking the road into Jerusalem. You know, you enter a city, and sometimes they have that big billboard that has some wonderful slogan about the city that you're arriving into. But how about coming into Jerusalem and seeing on that billboard, "Welcome to Jerusalem, the city where prophets are slain and God's messengers are stoned." Welcome to Jerusalem. It's amazing if you think about it, right? Here are a people, Israel, who are historically marked by their relationship to God. This is how the Jews have been known and distinguished since the beginning of time. And yet Israel is also so obstinate, and historically has been so obstinate to God and the messengers whom God has sent to them throughout their entire history. And unfortunately, it's a truth that it is oftentimes the people who are most religious that are oftentimes the most resistant to God's activity and God's people. However, in spite of their consistent rejection of Jesus, we see here that these words reveal Jesus' heart for them in spite of this resistance. Jesus describes and expresses his desire for the people of Jerusalem through the imagery of a mothering hen who watches over her young. And this expresses Jesus' longing to gather his people like a hen gathers her young under her wing. And it reveals God's constant desire to intimately care for, to nurture, and to protect his people from the foxes who would lure them away and seek to devour them. And there's only one thing that prevents God from exercising this type of care, and it's that a people would be resistant and not want to be cared for and nurtured by God. And that is who the Pharisees are. And unfortunately, that is who many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem are as well. They are a people who Jesus longs to care for and yet have no desire to be cared for by him. And as a result of that, Jesus laments the painful reality of their tragic predicament. We see it here in verse 35. Jesus says of them who reject him, "Behold, your house is forsaken." And Jesus is saying that because they have not recognized Jesus as God's anointed Messiah, that they will be forsaken. Now, this may sound harsh, but this is a reality that should not come as a surprise to the Jewish nation. For God had warned them that this very thing would happen if they rejected him. We read it in the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 22, verse 5. He says, "But if you will not obey these words, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that this house shall become a desolation." And now we find that which was warned through the prophets of old is now being ushered in through the prophet of new, that being Jesus. And that this time of abandonment and of desolation has now come. And rather than gathering under God's wings, here are, quote unquote, God's elect people running from the nest of the hen who longs to nurture them. And God is saying, Jesus is saying to them, because you are doing this, you are being left exposed. You're vulnerable. Earlier in chapter 13, in verses 5 to 9, Jesus warned them that unless they repent, that they will perish. And Jesus describes them like a tree that in time, if it does not bear fruit, will be chopped down. And the warning here is very clear, that if they do not receive Jesus as the promised Messiah, that God will abandon them and that God will judge them, and it will happen. Now, within about 30 years of Jesus speaking this prophecy to the city of Jerusalem was indeed exposed and left vulnerable. The city was destroyed by the Romans in 68 to 70 AD. And according to Jewish historian Josephus, the city was starved into submission by the Romans. Josephus says that the women hid on rooftops with their babies in their arms, that the alleyways were filled with the dead bodies of the elderly. And in fact, there were so many dead bodies in the city of Jerusalem that there was nowhere left to bury their dead, and they began to just fling them over the city wall. It was a brutal time for the city of Jerusalem, and many people believe that time it signaled an earthly fulfillment of this passage. I'm not sure, but believe it or not, the warning that Jesus is giving is a far greater reality than that one. That the warning that Jesus is speaking of a house that is desolate and a people who will be judged, their judgment will make the desolation of Jerusalem in AD 70 look like a picnic. because the desolation and the judgment that is coming for them is not temporal. It will not end when they die. It will not end when the famine is over. It will not end when Roman rule cedes. It will be eternal. But this warning that Jesus gives to Jerusalem, fortunately, also comes with a word of hope here in verse 35. Jesus says to them, "And I tell you, you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Now here Jesus is citing Psalm 118, verse 26, which alludes to the coming messianic figure who comes and brings God's deliverance with him. And Israel is to accept Jesus as this deliverer, as this fulfillment of Psalm 118. And until they do that very thing, Jesus is warning them, you are vulnerable and you are exposed to God's judgment. Now, there are many different interpretations of this one verse, but most of the commentaries believe, some interpret it to say that they will not recognize Jesus as the deliverer until it's too late when Jesus returns. But most commentators believe that Luke is using this remark from Jesus to hold out hope for the nation of Israel. That even though they currently reject Jesus as the Messiah, that there is a day that is coming when there will be a great revival of Jews coming to Jesus. Now Luke records this very thing in Luke 21, verse 24. He prophesies this. He says, this is Jesus speaking, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." And in Luke 21, Jesus is anticipating a day after many Gentiles like us, most of us here are Gentiles, are grafted into the family of God, when God will also graft back in his elect people, those whom he chose from the very beginning. And Jesus anticipates a day when, coming into the city of Jerusalem, he will be greeted by the messianic words of Psalm 118, verse 26. Now, providentially, in a matter of months here, Jesus will make his way back into Jerusalem for the last time in his earthly ministries, as if there was more than one ministry. Jesus was making his way into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festivities. And as he was making his way into the city, he was in fact greeted with these very words. He was greeted with the words, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, this event is one that's commemorated and celebrated by the church, and it's called Palm Sunday, and we will be celebrating it next week. But as we will see next week, the messianic fervor that was directed towards Jesus was very misguided. They were indeed looking for a Messiah, but Jesus was not fitting the bill. He was not meeting the expectations that they had. They expected that once Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he would then overturn the Romans and put God's people back into ruling and reigning over their own people. But instead, Jesus had in mind a very different outcome. As he predicted right here in Luke 13, Jesus would take his turn in line with the other prophets of old who perished and were put to death in this city, and he would stand there as a prophet slain by his own people there in the city of Jerusalem. Jesus would be conspired against and betrayed, not through Herod and the Pharisees, but through one of his own disciples. He would be tried in a kangaroo court and found guilty, though he was an innocent man. He would be sentenced to death by crucifixion. And I have no doubt that on that day, Herod rejoiced. I have no doubt that on that day, as Jesus hung there on the cross, that many and most of the Pharisees likewise rejoiced. And I have no doubt that on that day, they believed, Jesus' disciples likely believed, that the cunning foxes had finally won. But little did the sly foxes know that this would be the very means by which the hen would gather her young to herself to safely protect them from the foxes forevermore. Because the rejected stone became the cornerstone. And through the death of Jesus, Jesus would become a once and for all time sufficient sacrifice for sinners. Jesus would bear the full brunt of God's judgment against sins, including the sins of those who had previously rejected him. Jesus would become that desolated and judged house that was empty and forsaken. Jesus would die in our place, and then he would be raised on the third day, just as he promised. And just as Jesus predicted, his death and his life was not ultimately in the hands of those who conspired to kill him, because Jesus was sovereignly in control of his life and his own death the entire time. Jesus asserted this in John 10:18 when speaking about previous death threats that he received. Jesus says of his own life, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again." And the tender, gathering heart of God towards sinners like us is most tangibly displayed through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. These events, these circumstances, these conspiracies to put Jesus to death were ordained by God before he laid the foundations of this earth down. And all of this was done in order that Jesus would be and open a door of salvation for all who would receive him. But we have seen in this passage that just because that is the desire of Jesus, that just because that is the work of Jesus that made this possible, that just because Jesus might desire that all men and women be saved, we know the reality is that they aren't. That there are those who will reject Jesus. And the warning that is provided in this passage tells us what happens for those of us who do reject him. That if there's anyone who is here this morning who has built their life upon anything other than the foundation of Jesus Christ, you and I build our houses in vain. Because everything we have placed our hopes in will one day be gone. Our houses will become desolate. They will become empty. They will become vulnerable and exposed. And we, if it's too late, will no longer have an opportunity to escape the judgment that is there for us. Which is why we must heed the call of the gospel while we still have breath in our lungs. Now, perhaps you're here this morning and your entire life has been marked by rejecting Jesus. Maybe you're not like Herod. Maybe you're not like the Pharisees, and maybe you've never been hostile about it. You've never really hated Jesus. You've never really denied the existence of Jesus. But maybe you've just been hesitant to receive Jesus as your Savior. Maybe you're just worried about turning your life over to him. Maybe you're concerned that if you do that, that the consequences of that is the things that you love in this world will be gone. You're worried about your happiness. You're worried about your future. You're worried about your security. And going to Jesus means the things that you've always hoped for and found your security in will vanish. And it's true, they will. And I don't mean to be brash here, but if you're worried about that, you've got bigger worries. Because Jesus has told us what happens to those of us who do not trust in him alone. It's not good. But what we find in this passage is a Savior who longs for you to come to him, who is eager to receive you like a mother hen would receive her young, to gather you, to graft you into his family in order that he might care for you and nurture you and protect you from the foxes that seek your destruction. This passage highlights the magnificence of Jesus Christ. So if you don't know him, call on him this morning. He will save you. And I can assure you that whatever concerns you had, whatever hesitations you have in your heart about not coming to him, those things will quickly vanish once you come to him. I can assure you of that. My life is living proof of it. Now, if you're a Christian that's here this morning, I believe this is also a reminder for us of the blessing that comes to us when we faithfully follow Jesus, but that it also warns us of the exposure and the vulnerability that we find when we don't follow Jesus. I think it was Paul Tripp that gives is it Paul Tripp that gives the illustration of the umbrella? Yeah? No? Okay. Yeah. I knew somebody in this group would know it. I think it's Paul Tripp. He gives this illustration of an umbrella. And basically, he's saying it's raining outside, but the umbrella is the imagery of if you're a Christian and you're near to Jesus and you're following him closely, that you're under that umbrella and you're protected. But if you're a Christian, when you aren't following Jesus, that what you're doing is you're stepping outside of that umbrella and you're leaving yourself exposed to the elements, that you get rained upon, and that you're left vulnerable of sin and its consequences in your life. And so the illustration serves as a reminder of the importance of a Christian walking closely with Jesus and being faithful. And I think this passage is a reminder of not only Jesus' desires to gather us near to him, but also the vulnerability for those of us who don't walk nearly with him. But Jesus is magnificent. Jesus knew this road that laid ahead for him, and yet he was determined to walk it in order that he might die for your sins and mine. And this steely commitment that Jesus had to the cross was at its base and at its core grounded in the love of God for you. That Jesus had in his heart a desire to gather to himself a people that he might save and love and nurture and care for and protect. And so he purchases these people with his own blood. This is what God does. This is what he can and will do for all who will call upon Jesus. And this is the promise that stands for people who have previously rejected Jesus. Maybe you've rejected Jesus your entire life. It's not too late. Jesus is holding out hope for you this morning and for any others who have rejected him their entire lives. And this is also why it's so important for us to recognize that Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, you can look at it two ways. It's either an opportunity or a warning, right? Because when he comes back, it will be too late. And I choose to see that reality, which is there for all of us as Christians, as a wonderful opportunity for us to spread the gospel, to spread the love of Christ for all who do not know him, including spreading it and sharing it with those who have previously rejected Jesus for years and years and years. Sharing with them the heart and the intentions of Christ to gather them to himself. That forgiveness and life and security and joy is found in him. And that's what Jesus longs to do. Because what I long to see, and what I know you long to see too, is that when Christ returns, that the number of people that we know and love will be among those saying to him, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Let's pray.